question is, all of the effort on infrastructure, all of the effort being exerted this week, as a matter of fact, in Washington on infrastructure, misplaced? I ask the question because Peter Nicholas, who will join me in just a sec, has written a great essay for The Atlantic. Is Biden doing enough to protect democracy? And among other things that are contained in his piece, he quotes the director of the Brennan Center for Justice's democracy program as saying, this year, 19 states have passed 33 laws creating obstacles to the most fundamental American right, part of a multi-pronged effort to sabotage elections. Of course, what Wendy Weiser would describe as voter intimidation, to Republicans, they would say that's a ballot security initiative. But Adam Schiff, the California congressman, is someone else with whom Peter spoke. And I thought he had a very insightful comment when he said, Congressman Schiff, what good is expanded broadband, after all, if it only helps an autocratic government spread democracy-destroying disinformation? This is Peter Nicholas. Peter, thank you so much for coming back to the program.
Michael, great to be with you.
Why do you think, as between infrastructure, say, and voting rights, the administration chose to go with the former and not the latter?
It's really a fascinating question. I believe that the administration thought that infrastructure is something that might achieve some bipartisan consensus. But that's proved to be a faulty theory because we've seen so much divisiveness over the infrastructure package. I think there was some concern in the White House that voting rights is more divisive, more polarizing, and might be harder to might prove to be harder to get a bill passed. But what we're seeing is everything is hard in Washington these days. No piece of legislation that's consequential is easy to do. So it begs the question, maybe voting rights should have been the priority that Biden took up first, because it's so fundamental, as you pointed out in your intro.
It is, but then again, it doesn't come with the tangible bennies on which you can run in the midterm elections. Like, I get the argument. The argument says, hey, if we don't get the elections right, then little else matters. On the other hand, if there's a highway being built in my congressional district and I can point to it and say, those are your stimulus dollars or infrastructure dollars at work, that's probably a credible factor to my reelection.
I do think that's a good point, and I think that that's the political calculation that's at work. But it does raise the question that if we don't have voting rights, if election districts are gerrymandered, if voting rights are suppressed, if people can't get to the polls, then we really are abandoning the whole notion of self-government, of self-rule, of popular government in America. This 2-century experiment begins to vanish. And so, as I pointed out in the piece, this was actually my phrase, not Adam Schiff's, but we won't have broadband. I mean, it's fine to have broadband, it's fine to expand it, but if it's being used for anti-democratic or liberal purposes, it's really, of what value is it?
So before we talk about process, what is the Freedom to Vote Act? What would it do?
So this is a bill that has the advantage of being supported by all 50 members of the Democratic caucus. Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, both moderate Democrats who balked at other pieces of Biden's agenda, they support it. And what it would do is it would set national standards for voting. So there would be a 2-week early voting period. There'd be no excuse absentee voting allowed. There would be more criteria in place for redistricting to cut down or guard against the possibility of gerrymandering. So the bill would set some national standards that all states and jurisdictions would have to apply. And it would have the effect of expanding voting protections and beating back some of these efforts to deprive Americans of their fundamental right to vote.
Okay, so if all 50 Democrats and then Vice President Kamala Harris would step in and break a tie to the uninitiated, they would say, well, why isn't that enough? That's 51.
Well, that's right. And but we have a filibuster rule in the Senate, which says you need a supermajority of 60 votes to get most consequential legislation passed. So where we stand right now is Joe Manchin, who is a big believer in the filibuster rule, is trying to round up 10 votes, 10 Republican votes that would go along with the 50 Democratic votes. We would clear the 60 vote supermajority filibuster threshold. But that is a quixotic effort. That's not working out so well. And I quote various Democratic senators and congressmen in my story saying Manchin will never get that. I quote Eric Swalwell, a Democratic congressman from California, says Manchin won't get half of that. Manchin won't get half of that.
So, Peter, then the choice becomes what? Either you get rid of the filibuster. Actually, I have a naive question, and it's my own. Could you get rid of the filibuster just for this?
You could. It's a very good question. You could do a carve out, Michael, just for this one issue. I mean, the Senate basically sets its own rules. If you have a majority vote, you can change your rules. So if they wanted to, they could carve out an exception just for voting rights and leave the filibuster intact for other issues. And that might be a way to placate Manchin and Sinema. In fact, Manchin and Sinema might have some political cover to lift the filibuster, because they could say, look, we tried. We tried to get 10 Republican votes to go along with us on voting rights, and we just couldn't do it. So forgive us. We're going to carve out this exception for this one issue this time.
It's kind of interesting. It takes 60 votes to pass something in the context you've described, unless there's reconciliation. But it takes only 50 plus 1 to change the rules, including the rule about the 60 votes.
Yeah, it seems like a catch-22, doesn't it?
And this is not a subject for reconciliation. This is not budgetary in nature. No amount of sleight of hand is going to allow the Senate parliamentarian to say, oh, go ahead for voting rights and treat it like it's a budgetary matter.
Correct. I believe that's right. So really, as a practical matter, the only alternative here, the only way these protections are going to kick in is if the filibuster is lifted. Either it's done away with entirely, or there's a special carve out for voting protections. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Democratic leader, says he's going to bring the bill up for a vote this week, maybe as early as Wednesday. So this process is happening now, and the clock is ticking because Republican-controlled state legislatures are starting to carve new district lines based on the 2020 census. So the hope among voting rights advocates is that this bill pass quickly so that these maps are subject to the criteria in this bill.
But Peter, what is the vote? Is the vote on this reform measure, or is it on getting rid of the filibuster, a carve out, as you put it, just for this issue?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think what's going to happen is Democrats want progress on this issue. They want to show some progress. So I think this is going to be a real gut check moment for Manchin and Sinema. They're going to have to decide if voting protections are enough of a priority that it's worth lifting the filibuster. And if they decide it's not, I don't see how this bill is going to pass.
So let me go back to where I began, and it is the title of your piece in The Atlantic. Is Biden, let's talk about the president, is he himself doing enough to protect democracy?
So we quote Sherrod Brown, who's an Ohio Democratic senator, whose answer to that question was no, of course not. And we spoke to others too. I spoke to a state representative from Texas, one of the Democrats who broke quorum and flew to Washington to deny Republican legislators in Texas an opportunity to pass legislation that would restrict voting rights. And this lawmaker said, look, Lyndon Johnson in 1965 passed a landmark voting rights act, and he did it through persuasion. He did it through by coaxing different senators, by making it a priority, and he got it done. And it's not very clear that that President Biden is devoting the same energy to this. And if it doesn't happen, if there's not sufficient presidential leadership, it's hard to see how the filibuster gets lifted and this bill passes.
Do the folks at the Brennan Center think that this is enough to offset the move that has been afoot in so many different Republican-controlled states?
I think they feel this is a really good start, that this is a really important legislation, maybe some of the most consequential legislation to beat back these efforts to restrict voting rights that we've seen in years. So yes, the Brennan Center is definitely on board with this bill.
I'm glad you wrote the piece, because it's certainly true that all the oxygen in the room has been taken up by discussion about infrastructure, the 1.2, the 3.5, or whatever it may, the latter ultimately be, but very little has been consumed with this very important issue.
It's very strange. I went back and Biden gave a speech at the White House a couple of weeks ago, and it was, he wanted to talk about the monthly job numbers, but he used that opportunity to also talk about climate change, to talk about the unemployment rate, to talk about electric vehicles, to talk about plug-in charging stations. Not one word was devoted to voting rights. And I just wonder about the prioritization, because as you know, a president's time is the most valuable commodity that he has. And if you're not talking about something, it's not on people's radar. Why not use this opportunity and every opportunity to talk about voting rights protections, given how fundamental it is to the identity, to the democratic identity and character and heritage of this country?
Peter, thanks so much for framing this issue. It's a great subject for conversation, and it remains to be seen, what do Senators Manchin and Sinema do if, in fact, this is the week where some type of a vote comes up. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be with you as always.